In a small, peaceful village at the edge of a lush valley, there lived a farmer named Thomas. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with rough hands that had been calloused by years of hard work. His clothes were simple, a faded shirt and pants, worn from constant use. His face had the lines of age and labor, but there was kindness in his brown eyes. He didn't have much, but what he had, he worked for with pride. Thomas had a wife, Clara, who was the heart of their home. She was a woman of remarkable beauty, with dark, flowing hair that cascaded down her back like the rich soil of their farm. Her skin was smooth and fair, and her eyes, the color of the river that ran through the village, sparkled with a light that made every man who crossed her path look twice. But Clara was more than just beautiful. She was clever and quick-witted, always finding solutions to problems others couldn't solve. She had a soft voice that was always kind, and a smile that could melt the coldest heart. Her wisdom wasn't learned from books or teachers, but from the simple joys and struggles of everyday life. People in the village came to her for advice, knowing that she had an understanding that went far beyond what they could see on the surface. In the evenings, when Thomas returned from the fields, Clara would prepare a warm meal. She had a gentle way of speaking, her voice like a sweet melody. She would sit with Thomas, telling him about the village happenings, while he listened attentively, occasionally offering his own thoughts. Their life was simple but peaceful. They didn't have much wealth, but their home was filled with warmth and love. And while the village saw Thomas as a strong and hard-working man, it was Clara who was the true gem of the community. A day's ride away, in a large town filled with busy markets and towering buildings, lived Gregory, a wealthy merchant. His shop was filled with rare goods, spices, and expensive fabrics. He was a man who prided himself on his intelligence and wealth. He dressed in fine clothes, his boots polished to perfection. He was proud of his success and believed it made him superior to the simple people who lived in villages like the one Thomas and Clara called home. Gregory was a man who thought he had seen everything and knew everyone. His knowledge of the world was vast, and he enjoyed showing off his wealth to anyone who would listen. Yet, despite his many accomplishments, there was one thing he didn't have: a wife who truly loved him. His wife, Maria, was beautiful, with soft blonde hair that shone like gold, and eyes that looked like they had once been full of light, but now only held sadness. Maria was quiet and kind, but her heart had grown heavy with loneliness. Gregory was rarely home, too busy with his business to notice her needs. She longed for something deeper than wealth and status, a life filled with warmth, love, and companionship. But she never knew how to ask for it. Gregory, on the other hand, remained oblivious to her pain, as he was consumed by his own pride. One day, While Gregory was visiting his shop, he overheard two travelers discussing the wisdom of a farmer's wife in a nearby village. They spoke of her kindness, her intelligence, and the way she always seemed to know exactly what to say. Curious, Gregory decided that he would go to the village and see for himself. How could a simple farmer's wife possess such wisdom? Surely they were exaggerating. With a smirk on his face, Gregory decided, I will prove that this farmer's wife is no match for my knowledge. He made up his mind to visit the village the very next day. The following morning, Gregory set out for the village. He left behind his fine horses and carriage, opting instead for a simple one to blend in. When he arrived, he was immediately struck by the contrast. The village was far different from the town he came from. Quieter, simpler, but with a charm that was undeniable. People here didn't wear fine clothes or live in large houses. They lived modestly, but with pride. Gregory finally arrived at Thomas and Clara's home, where Thomas was working in the fields. He approached the farmer, sizing him up. Gregory couldn't understand how a man like this could be married to a woman of such beauty and intelligence. Hello? Gregory greeted him, trying to sound casual. I've heard much about your wife. They say she's wise beyond measure. Is that true? Thomas, who had stopped his work for a moment, wiped his brow and smiled. Yes, my wife is clever, he said simply. But it's not the kind of wisdom that can be measured by books or knowledge. Gregory, intrigued and somewhat skeptical, raised an eyebrow. And where does she get her wisdom from, if not from books? Thomas chuckled softly. She gets it from the heart, from living, and from helping those around her. Gregory's pride was ruffled. I'd like to meet her. I find it hard to believe that someone like her, with no education, could be as wise as you say. Thomas nodded and invited him into their home. I'll let you see for yourself. When Clara entered the room, Gregory was taken aback by her beauty. She was more than just a pretty face. There was an air about her that drew people in. She was confident in a way that made her seem untouchable. And yet she exuded a warmth that made you want to be near her. Clara greeted Gregory with a smile, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Welcome to our home, she said in a soft, melodic voice. How can I help you? Gregory was stunned for a moment. He had expected her to be more humble, more reserved. But there was something about her presence that made him feel both intrigued and a little uncomfortable. He quickly composed himself. I've heard about your wisdom, and I wanted to see if it's true, Gregory said. You know, in the town, people believe you have a way of solving problems. I'm curious to know how someone like you, with no formal education, could have such insights. Clara smiled and sat down at the table, her posture relaxed but graceful. "Well, wisdom isn't always about knowledge," she said. "Sometimes it's about understanding the world in a way that allows you to connect with others." Gregory's mind raced. He didn't understand how this woman, so unlike the educated, proud people he knew, could speak with such authority. He decided to test her. "I'd like to see your wisdom in action," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of challenge. "What can you teach me?" The next day, Gregory returned to the village with a few simple questions. He was determined to prove that his knowledge was superior. He had arranged a small gathering in the village square, where he would test Thomas and Clara's wisdom in front of the villagers. As the villagers gathered, Gregory stood tall, ready to prove himself. Clara and Thomas arrived together, their hands linked. Clara's eyes sparkled as she took in the crowd, her presence magnetic. The village chief, a wise old man named Samuel, stood up and announced, "Today, we will see who is truly wise, based not on what they know, but on how they live." Gregory smiled, thinking this would be easy. He had spent years reading books, gaining knowledge, but Clara's calm demeanor made him uncertain. The first question was simple. "How many grains of rice are in this sack?" Gregory asked, already certain of the answer. Thomas simply smiled and replied, "I don't know the exact number, but this sack is enough to feed a family for many days." Gregory frowned. This wasn't the answer he expected. The crowd in the village square waited eagerly as the challenge began. Gregory stood tall, a confident smile on his face. Clara and Thomas stood side by side, their expressions calm, as if they were not at all concerned about the questions that would be asked. The village chief, Samuel, looked out over the crowd, his old eyes filled with wisdom. "We will begin with a simple question," he said, turning to Thomas. "Tell me, farmer, how many grains of rice are in this sack?" Gregory held up a sack of rice, which had been carefully weighed and sealed earlier that morning. He watched closely, hoping to catch Thomas off guard. Thomas glanced at the sack, then looked back at the chief. "I don't know the exact number," he said with a gentle smile, "but I do know that it will be enough to feed a family for a good long time." The villagers nodded, and Gregory's face tightened with frustration. "That's not the answer I was expecting," he said, clearly displeased. "You should have counted them." Thomas shrugged lightly, his eyes filled with kindness. "If you'd like to count the grains, you're welcome to. But what matters is not the exact number. It's that this sack will feed those in need." The villagers murmured in agreement. They understood that Thomas wasn't concerned with numbers. He was thinking about the bigger picture, the well-being of others. Gregory stood quietly, unsure of how to respond. He had expected a simple, factual answer, but Thomas's wisdom was not so easily measured. The village chief nodded, signaling that the next question was ready. He turned to Gregory and said, "Now, we'll see what you know. Where does the sun set first?" Gregory looked proud of himself as he stood tall. "The sun sets in the west, of course," he answered confidently, his voice filled with certainty. The villagers watched quietly, waiting for Thomas's response. The chief then turned to Thomas. "And you, Thomas, where does the sun set first?" Thomas took a deep breath and smiled at Clara, his eyes softening. Clara's beauty was evident, not just in her looks, but in the quiet way she carried herself, her grace, her wisdom. He knew that she was the light of his world, the one who made everything better. "The sun sets first in my heart," he said simply, "for my day always ends with my wife. She is where my world begins." The villagers exchanged glances, some smiling, others looking at each other in surprise. Gregory, however, was stunned. He had expected a scientific answer, one rooted in geography or astronomy. But instead, Thomas had given a deeply personal response, one that spoke to his love and respect for Clara. Gregory stood frozen, unsure of how to reply. He had come expecting to prove his superiority, but now he was beginning to question himself. What mattered more, facts and knowledge, or something deeper? As the day wore on and the challenge continued, Gregory's confidence began to waver. Thomas's answers weren't based on what Gregory had learned in books or seen in the world. Instead, they came from something that Gregory couldn't quite grasp: wisdom, kindness, and love. Gregory had spent his entire life chasing wealth and knowledge. He had convinced himself that these things made him better than others. But now, standing before Thomas and Clara, he was starting to feel small. Gregory looked around at the villagers, who were clearly moved by Thomas's words. They had respected Thomas for years, not because of his wealth or his education, but because of the way he treated people. His generosity, his willingness to help others, and his deep love for Clara had earned him the respect of everyone around him. For the first time, Gregory felt the weight of his arrogance. His wealth, his knowledge, they didn't seem so important now. What had he truly gained by chasing after these things? He had neglected his wife, Maria, and never truly understood the simple joys of life. He had lived with pride and without humility. He turned to Clara, whose presence seemed to glow as she quietly observed the challenge. "You are not just wise," he said, his voice softening. "You are truly remarkable." Clara smiled warmly at him. "Wisdom comes from understanding and kindness," she said simply. "And everyone has the ability to learn, even if it takes time." Gregory looked at her for a long moment, his thoughts swirling. He realized now that it wasn't enough to be clever or wealthy. What really mattered was the way you treated others, the way you lived your life, and the love you shared with those closest to you. Meanwhile, Maria, Gregory's wife, had been quietly watching from the sidelines. She had heard the challenge and seen the way Gregory had been caught off guard by Thomas's wisdom. She had watched her husband closely, noting the subtle changes in his expressions as he realized how much he had missed. Maria was a beautiful woman with golden hair that shimmered in the sunlight and eyes that reflected a depth of emotion. She'd always been kind and graceful, but there was a sadness in her heart. She had longed for her husband's attention, for his respect, for a deeper connection that had never seemed to come. Now, as she saw Gregory standing in front of Thomas and Clara, she realized something important. Gregory was beginning to change. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he now listened to others with more humility. After the challenge ended, Maria approached Clara, her steps slow and deliberate. Clara greeted her with a smile, sensing the quiet strength in the woman. "I've seen the change in my husband," Maria said softly, "and I'm grateful. I've waited so long for him to see what truly matters." Clara smiled warmly. "It's never too late to learn, Maria. Love and respect are the foundation of everything." Maria nodded, her heart lifting. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope stirring inside her. She knew that with time, she and Gregory could find a new beginning, one built on mutual respect and kindness, just like Thomas and Clara. As the day ended, Gregory walked alongside Thomas and Clara, his steps slower now, more thoughtful. "I came here thinking I had all the answers," he admitted. "But I see now that I have so much more to learn. I was blinded by my pride." Thomas smiled at him. "It's never too late to change, Gregory. The most important thing is that you recognize the truth." Gregory nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He had spent so many years chasing the wrong things, but now he understood what truly mattered. He looked at his wife, Maria, who stood a little apart from him, her face filled with a quiet joy. "I'm sorry, Maria," Gregory said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I haven't always been the husband you deserved, but I promise to change." Maria looked at him, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I believe you, Gregory, she said gently. I've always believed in you. And now I can see that you believe in yourself. As they walked home together, the village behind them seemed to glow in the soft light of the setting sun. Gregory had learned a valuable lesson that day, one that would change his life forever. And as for Thomas and Clara, they knew that their wisdom, their love, and their kindness had made a difference.